I'm working at the University of Minnesota, right down the road in the ecology department, and this is going to be a pretty science-heavy talk. I hope you guys all follow along, but this is sort of a run through some peer-reviewed literature, some papers that we've been doing. So feel free if anything is sort of confusing, be sure you raise your hand and ask what's going on. So here's just my general talk outline for the night. We're going to be talking a little bit of background about why I'm studying what I'm studying, and then we'll go into two different challenges about using roadsides as habitat for pollinators in particular. And so challenge one is the chemical ecology of roadsides. And I will talk about an idea called an ecological trap, and we'll see whether roads are an ecological trap for pollinators. And then challenge two, thinking about how we might revegetate our roadsides in a way that'll benefit pollinators. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I've got going on now and some future work. So these are just some figures I've taken from other studies that show generally we've been aware for a long while that there's been biodiversity declines and deforestation in a lot of vertebrates and fish. We're a little slow on the uptake with insects, but we've been losing a lot of insects. And don't worry about exactly what's on these figures. The main thing is that some insect species are going up in numbers, but many are going down. And so there are declines in the amount of insects that we're seeing in the literature. And this little figure, death by 1,000 cuts, it's not just one reason why we're losing insects. There are many different reasons. And so those include, I understand this text is pretty small, but things like introduced species, agricultural intensification, deforestation, different chemical issues like insecticides or pollution, fertilizers. I know that the top is cut off there. So we've got fire and storm intensity and climate change, droughts, things of that nature. And so it's not just a real simple thing where, hey, if we stop spraying this chemical, all the bugs will come back, where there's a lot of different things going on. So I'm mostly going to be talking about monarchs today. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of background. You may already know all this, but we're going to sort of focus on monarchs. So as most of you probably do know, that the monarch's host plant is milkweeds. And so that means that a female monarch will lay her egg on a milkweed, and that caterpillar pretty much must eat milkweed until it's large enough to go through metamorphosis and become an adult butterfly. A common misconception is that milkweeds need monarchs. Milkweeds are actually trying to kill monarchs. They have toxins that they have in the milkweed that is trying to kill the monarchs, and the monarchs can actually sequester those toxins and make themselves poisonous to other insects. So there's been really interesting coevolution between these milkweeds that are trying to kill the monarchs and the monarchs who need the milkweeds while they're feeding them. And they take those toxins that our plants are using. But that being said, milkweeds are very important for monarchs. So one thing that's interesting that you may or may not know, that in the winter, the monarchs, many butterflies might overwinter right around here as a pupa or caterpillar. They spend the winter dormant, but monarchs actually migrate all the way down to Mexico in the fall. This is a picture of the monarchs down in Mexico. You can see they're in great abundance, and then they migrate back up. And then when they get back here, they might have several generations. And so it's really fascinating when you think about a monarch that is here in June. If we're thinking about a female monarch, her daughter might have a generation here, and her daughter might have to fly all the way to Mexico and start her way back up. And so you have this weird sort of life history that varies depending on what time of year it is for these monarchs. Down in the bottom left, we have a graph that shows the monarch population in millions that's showing up at this hibernation site through time. That's starting in 1993, and it's moving through close to present, and you can see monarchs have been declining down in that overwintering range. And so that's one of these insect declines that we are worried about. Habitat loss is a major reason that we think for this decline. So this is a map of Minnesota. The yellow on this map, most of this map shows the land use from, I think it's right around 1800, turn of the century. So the yellow is prairies, and the little bits of red are what's remaining as prairie. And so you can see that the whole south and western part of Minnesota used to be prairie, and there's just a little bit left. In the last 10 to 15 years, there have been agricultural advancements that improve the type of yield we're getting out of fields by using these herbicides that do not kill the corn, but they kill everything else. And so a lot of corn and soybean fields used to have a lot of milkweeds in them, and monarchs would use that as habitat. And in the last 15 years or so, due to these changes in agriculture, a lot of that milkweed has gone away. And so that's one of the, so even though these changes to agriculture happened a long while ago, in the last 10 to 15 years, even within those cornfields that may have been serving as habitat for monarchs, a lot of that milkweed is gone. So yeah. And so scientists who've been thinking about monarchs and worried about monarchs have sort of talked about this all hands on deck approach. Like I said, that slide that's death by many cuts or 1,000 cuts. We want to think about every single different thing we can do to try to help monarchs. And one of the things that have been talked about are managing roadsides for monarchs. And so not many people think about roadsides as this beautiful wildlife habitat, but there are some advantages when you think about roadsides, especially in agricultural habitats. There's a grid of publicly managed land all across these areas. And so one, they're available for restoration since they're publicly owned. Two, they're pretty much everywhere where there's problems with habitat loss. And so we can think of them as a little bit of an opportunity. But of course, roads, typically we can think of some biodiversity negatives. So collisions with vehicles, they cause fragmentation, they can separate animal populations, they enhance people getting around, which means people can do all the stuff people do, extract resources, go around, and they can cause pollution. There's this program that has been put together by a group of folks called the Monarch Highway. And the idea here is that red line in the middle is I-35. And that broadly represents the same path the monarchs take from their hibernation spot in Mexico. You can see that blue dot at the bottom. That is where they overwinter in Mexico, and then they migrate up there. And so this monarch highway is this idea that we should really be trying to help with habitat, not just along roadsides, not just along I-35, but everywhere sort of in this general corridor. We can try to do different things to help put some habitat on the landscape. And so there's this idea of the monarch highway that generally follows the same path that I-35 does. So when we're thinking about roads as habitat, I'm going to go into sort of a little interesting piece about monarchs. And so obviously we're all Minnesotans here. I don't think anyone drove from Florida to come here today. You know that we put a ton of salt on our roads in the winter to help de-ice those roads. And on the right, this map here is a map of sodium deposition in the country naturally. So you can see the red parts along the coast have some natural sodium deposition. There's available sodium. But you look where we are in the middle of the Great Plains, there's there's very little sodium. Sodium is a limiting resource. And interestingly, so animals need sodium. It's super important in our physiology, but plants do not. And so, particularly for herbivores, they often have this sodium limitation. That's why you see cattle or deer being attracted to salt licks. There's pictures up in Canada where moose come and lick cars because of how much they crave sodium because they don't get it in their normal plant diet. And that's actually especially true for a lot of butterflies. So as I was telling Stuart, I used to work on turtles, and this is a nice little segue, but turtles actually excrete sodium through their tears. And this is a picture of a bunch of butterflies drinking turtle tears because of how much they crave sodium. So they have this really strong sodium seeking behavior. And it gets a little more interesting and even into the sexual biology of these animals. And so because the sodium is limiting, what tends to happen is the males go around and collect the sodium in a behavior called puddling. And so if you've ever seen, sometimes you'll see it on like animal dung or somewhere an animal is urined on carrion, you'll see a bunch of butterflies. Has anyone here seen that before out in the, yep. And so what they're usually doing is they're getting mineral resources like sodium, and they're usually males doing that. And those, they then use those nutrients and pass it to the female when they mate in the form of what we call a nuptial gift. And so males are not very good fathers in the classic parental role, but what they do is when they mate, they give the female a giant nutrient-rich package along with their sperm that helps the female give her much-needed nutrients. And this is actually a reproductive organ in a female butterfly called the bursa copulatrix that is basically like a second stomach that helps digest these big nuptial gifts. So there's your little butterfly sex education for the day. But all this is to say that butterflies in particular have this really strong sodium seeking behavior that we see sometimes. Now this is a figure pulled from the scientific literature, and we've got these are just plots of prairies where they fertilized some with salt and they have control. So, you know, people fertilize with nitrogen or phosphorus, just fertilized with salt. And the statistic that's shown here, if it's above 0, it means the animals were preferring to be in the sodium enriched plot instead of the control. And you can see we have the first one there is total all insects. Then we have herbivorous insects, omnivorous insects, pollinators, predators, parasitoids. You go down the list, but you can see all of these animals are more prevalent in these side-by-side plots where people put sodium in a grassland. So just table salt is what I'm talking about here, sodium chloride. And so this just sort of lays the background for what we were thinking, like, okay, so we've got these roads. We want these butterflies to, you know, use them as habitat, and they also have all this extra salt in these roads. And we don't know anything about this. So what does this mean? And so the basic idea here that I'm looking at is, okay, we're putting all the salt on the roads. Does that salt make it up into the plants? Keep in mind that a female, we can moderate what we eat quite easily. If we don't eat straight table salt, if we're deficient in sodium, we might reach for a bag of potato chips or something. But a monarch caterpillar only has that one plant it's on to eat. So if that plant has, for example, way too much sodium, it doesn't have much of an option to go somewhere else. It can only go a little ways. So the big picture here that we're wondering about is, so we put all these salt on the roads. How much of that makes it into the plants? Do the butterflies care? Can they tell? Do they lay their eggs on those plants more, less? Do they avoid them? what happens to the caterpillars when they're eating this high sodium diet, and how does that impact pollinator health? So that's the whole kind of picture of what we were thinking about. Um, and I think I just sort of said all this. So we know milkweed is really abundant along roadsides, but declining elsewhere, but particularly in the agricultural part of the Midwest. And so monarchs might be even further attracted to these roadsides because of that extra salt. But it's possible that this vegetation might be toxic because of how much sodium is in there or other chemicals like heavy metal that come from roads. And so we have this prediction that roadside plants are an ecological trap for butterflies. And that just really means it's a trap. The butterflies like this salt. They go here, lay all their eggs, but it turns out it's actually a really bad habitat for them. So that's the hypothesis. And now I'm going to go through all the stuff we did to test the hypothesis. All right, so we have this prediction. Roadside plants are an ecological trap for butterflies. Actually, this is a good stopping point for a minute. Is everyone on board with following where I'm at? Yeah, okay. We'll dive in here. So how do roads influence the chemistry of these roadside plants? Does butterfly behavior affect how they're exposed to sodium? Can butterflies go around and avoid high sodium plants, that sort of a thing? And then what are the consequences on these developing offspring of a high sodium diet? So to test this big hypothesis, we want to answer these 3 questions with a whole bunch of different studies. And so I'll go into that. The first thing we did was we went all across the state of Minnesota. Well, not all across, but you can see that sort of the little green dots are all the sites we went. And so that's sort of the agricultural and prairie part of Minnesota. We went out into roadsides and we collected milkweeds. We clipped a milkweed, dried it, brought it back to the lab. We measured what type of road it was on, like was it a very busy road or a not so busy road? So traffic volume is what we're talking about, how many cars per day. And then how far from the road was it? Some are right in the ditch, some are 20 meters from the road edge. And one of the interesting things just to remember here is we're dumping all this salt in the winter, and then we usually have a typically wet spring. And so it might be that there's none of this. This all flushes out in the system before the time, in July when these plants are up. So we really weren't sure whether we're going to see this signature of high sodium in these roadside plants. So we just went out, collected a ton of these plants, brought them back into the lab, dried them, and did analytical chemistry analyses on them to see what the elemental content of these plants were. And so don't worry too much about those axes, but each dot on there would represent a plant. The vertical axis is how much sodium is in that plant, and the horizontal axis is how busy is that road. And so way on the right, a 10, that might be like a big interstate, where something on the other end might be like it was all paved roads, but it might be like a rural country paved road. And so you can see there's a lot of scatter. We see plants with low sodium next to big interstates and high sodium next to roads that aren't so busy. But overall, we found a positive relationship there. So milkweed along higher traffic roads have more sodium. And certainly those are the first priority for all those resources. So the state, we know for sure, puts, and counties and cities usually treat their biggest roads first and with more sodium. So this is expected, and it would give us a good evidence that, yeah, this salt that we're dumping on these roads is indeed getting into these plants. And then we also have the same thing, and this is the distance from road in meters on that axis. So it goes out to about 15 meters, which is, probably from me to the wall, which would be a pretty big road ditch there. And so if you go to a plant that far from the edge of the road, you see it has a lot less sodium. And right next to the road, there's a fair bit more sodium. And these are all log transformed data. And so that basically means I've compressed it, but there's a 302-fold range in milkweed salinity. So that means some of these plants have 302 times more sodium than others. So the point there is if you're looking at milkweeds in roadsides, there's a huge range in how salty these plants are, which can be a complicated thing for these butterflies to go try to figure out. And this is just both of those things on the same graph. So you can see that if you are far away from a low traffic road, you don't have a lot of salt. If you're really close to a high traffic road, you do have a lot of salt. And so that's just sort of what we're looking at. We also found some evidence of other metals, in particular zinc was elevated along roadsides. We found elevated lead in the soils, but not the plants. Lead was outlawed from leaded gasoline, but there used to be a lot of lead exhaust. So we still find that in the soil, but it's not making its way into the plants, thankfully. All right, so that was sort of the question one, which is like, how, is the sodium making it into the plants? And then sort of question two is, does the butterfly's behavior, and so we're thinking about the mom's behavior, does that influence her offspring's exposure? So a pregnant, a gravid female butterfly flies around and lays a lot of eggs, and she's got to find the right species of plant. And there's a lot of different factors the mom uses when she figures it out. If there's a bunch of other caterpillars already on that plant, it might not be good because that's too much competition for her offspring. So it's actually a pretty complicated decision for a butterfly. Where do I lay these eggs? And now we're throwing salt into the mix, which they usually aren't used to, but we know that the males at least really like the salt. And so it might be important sort of in their biology. So here's a couple, the sort of questions. So will butterflies, if butterflies can't even tell that there's salt there, that you would expect they'd be exposed to sodium at the exact same rate it occurs in the environment. If there's a lot of sodium in the environment here, their offspring are going to eat a lot of sodium. If there's not, they're not. But it's possible that these butterflies either seek out high sodium because they think it's an important nutrient, or they avoid it because maybe it's so high that they think it's going to be bad for their offspring. So those are the sort of questions we went into. And we tackled it a few different ways. One, we just looked at if you gave a caterpillar a choice of a salty leaf and a not salty leaf, does it care? And what we did is we just put it in a cup like that, gave them 2 leaves. One had a lot of salt. We would just mix up salt in a water bottle, spray it on, let it dry off. And so there was salt on the surface of the leaf compared to a control that didn't have elevated sodium. And then we just weighed the leaves after 24 hours. So we know how much did they eat. And I'll show a few graphs like this. This preference index isn't important, except for that a 1 means it only ate the salty plant. A 0, you can think of it as a percent of how much it ate. A 0 would mean it ate none of the salty plant, and a 0.5 is it doesn't care. It's eating both. We did like a bunch of different assays, and so I'm going to walk through them. We did the same thing with butterflies in the lab. We gave them a milkweed that with butterflies that were choosing to lay their eggs. And so the adult butterflies are eating nectar, which is a whole different thing that we weren't looking at. But here we're thinking about, do they lay their eggs differentially? So gave them 2 milkweeds, one with a lot of salt, one without, and went up and counted the eggs. And it's the same number here of, do they only lay on the salty one, or they avoid it, or no preference. And so this is sort of what that looked like in the greenhouse. We had 2 potted milkweed plants that we had just harvested from outside. We set them up, and that is it's through the sort of vinyl cover, but that is a butterfly laying her eggs on the milkweed. And we also did this in the field. So there's a high school student that worked with me, and we went out and we got 2 milkweeds next to each other, treated one with sodium, one as our control. And we had, I think, 150 pairs of these. And then we would come back every couple days and thoroughly look at them and count for eggs. So we sort of hit this question in a few different ways. And so this graph, again, the one at the very top means it loves the sodium, it loves the salt. The 0 would mean it completely avoids it, and 0.5 means it really doesn't care. It can't tell or it doesn't care. And so the dot is your average with a little standard error, but I'm just going to show it all for you. So we've got the monarch feeding, we've got monarch and monarch oviposition. And by and large, they just don't care. So the monarchs, there's maybe a little indication that the monarchs feeding can avoid it, but in nature, they have very little ability to actually find another plant that would have less sodium. So it's kind of leaning towards maybe they avoid it, but there's not much that an individual out in the wild could actually do about it. And so by and large, that really just means that they're going to be exposed to sodium at the same rate it's occurring in the environment. And so there's a couple reasons for that. And so one is these female butterflies might not have a long history through millions of years of evolution with this variation in foliar sodium or sodium in the leaves. And so they have other things that they're prioritizing, like they have tons of eggs and they got to lay them all before they get eaten or smashed by something. And so this choosiness also would have a cost. It's not like an elephant that's spending years and years and years investing in its one offspring. It's just putting as many eggs out as it can and quickly. And so maybe it can tell it's bad, but it's just easier to lay and move on, because that's sort of the name of the game for a lot of these insects. And then it's also possible there's other cues that aren't salt that are much more important to them, like how much nitrogen, which is what they will be using to make proteins, is in the leaf, or how competitive is it? Are there a bunch of other caterpillars on there? So ultimately, butterflies are going to be exposed to sodium at the rate it is present in those host plants. So I actually, for the sake of time, cut out the third one. But we did a whole lot of assays where we fed tons of caterpillars, high sodium diets, low sodium diets. In the lab, we measured their development rates. We added zinc in there too to say, hey, if there's the zinc and sodium at the same time, is that bad for them? We fed them and released them and tracked them flying to Mexico, which wasn't as successful as we wanted. So I could talk for another 20 minutes just about number 3. But the long story short, we're not seeing major negative effects of the diet either. And so we know that the roadsides influence the chemistry of these plants. The butterflies aren't really avoiding them or seeking them, but it also isn't as big of a deal for the offspring as we thought. And so we reject this prediction. So we do not think these roadside plants are a trap for butterflies. That's good news. That means there's one less pollution thing out there that we're worried about. It's not saying that dumping salt on roads isn't a problem for other organisms, but it's saying in this particular instance with monarch butterflies, it's not a problem. And so the big take-home message is these roadside plants, for the most part, are safe for monarch butterflies. So this set of projects took a couple years, and we moved on. And so that was, just to sort of reorient you, that was challenge 1, which I've sort of gone through. Chemical ecology of roadsides. Do roads lay an ecological trap? Not, at least in the chemical part of things. The cars are running over all these monarchs. That's a different thing. And there's certainly some sources of mortality there, but we think that the roads generally are probably an okay thing. So challenge 2 is, how do we manage these roadsides for pollinators in a cost-effective way? And so I will go into a little bit of background of this. And this was a grant that came from, the little background here is from the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So they plant, whenever they do road construction projects, you know, they basically obliterate whatever is in the road ditches. We all see it when we're driving around. And then they seed new things to come back. And sometimes they do these native prairie mixes that are full of native forbs and diverse grasses that are a lot more expensive. Sometimes they do something that is just really quick and is non-natives like alfalfa and things like that. And so they came to us and they're like, well, we invest all these money in these really nice native prairie mixes. We plant them and then we go on to our next road project and we just don't really even know. We're not tending it like you might a prairie restoration or a garden. They might get mowed annually, but they're not really getting the really intensive inputs that you would do if you had you were in charge of a huge prairie restoration project. Because anyone who's tended a garden knows it takes a lot of effort to keep that going on. And so this was a really nice project because they sort of came to us and was like, here's our problem. We're doing this, but we just don't know if it's helping the pollinators like we intend it to. But just a little history about roadsides in the US. In the 1950s, it was called America's Front Lawn, and we liked a nice mowed grass that looked just like your, classic pretty front lawn in the thing. And so a lot of native vegetation that might have existed was no more, and we had like typical lawn grasses that were mowed regularly. And then, as we moved along, we had this idea that this green infrastructure, as they call it, can do more. So those roots help stabilize the roadbed, help against erosion. The chemicals that we're talking about that might be coming from the roads before it gets into the water supply might be taken up by these plants, so sort of a filter. They're lower maintenance if you're not mowing them every week, and they can provide habitat, help with snowdrift, and just maybe beautification. It's nice to see wildflowers on the side of the road. But one of the problems with transportation funding, this is true for plants or bridges or roads, is you often have this grant, this pocket of money that helps with the upfront costs. So you might get a federal aid to build a bridge, but then the maintenance usually folds back over to the local governments that may not have as much money. So it's harder to get long-term maintenance money. And so it would be a big ask to ask the DOT to manage a roadside ditch like we might prairie reserve. Yeah, and here's just a picture of what, a road development project might look like, and you can see it obliterates a lot of the vegetation, and so that revegetation is a major issue. So we talked to them and we designed a study that we thought would hopefully understand they've got limited funds and try to think of what's the best way we can do with what you have to, help roadside plants and pollinators. So we had these two questions. One, what floral communities are created by current revegetation practices? And so what's MnDOT doing right now? And what's there right afterwards or a few years later or down the road? And then how do bumblebees and butterflies use these habitats? And in this particular study, we weren't thinking so much about the host plants, but more about drinking nectar and the floral resources, because these pollinators are drinking nectar from these plants. So we were more focused on flowering plants. So our methods, we worked with the state and with different counties to get basically the blueprints from construction projects that lay out exactly, these are done by civil engineers. So we have very precise plans that show exactly what seed mix was put in certain places. And we found projects that were anywhere from 2 years old to 20 years old. So we have a long sequence of of sites. So we get to know what do these plant communities look like for after 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so we went to each of these sites 6 times every 2 weeks throughout the summer. And we went out and did some plant sampling methods where we would put out quadrats, which is just a plastic square made from PVC. We put it down and we say what flowers are here, and we put it out in a random thing. And then we also did surveys for bumblebees and butterflies. So this is just an example of what one of those blueprints looks like. You can see this is over in Washington County in 2018. And these, can you see on here, these this mix right here was a non-native mix, and this mix right here was a native mix. So sometimes these were just right across the street from each other, pretty close, but they were put in at the same time. And the main difference was what did they seed there? And just for example, the non-native mix had Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, ryegrass, and then 2 flowering species, clover and alfalfa. Whereas the native one had, 4, 5, 6 grasses and 20 different forbs, including black-eyed Susans, prairie clover, things like that. And so one is a lot more expensive and a lot more diverse, and the other one is just a more simple mix. So here's exactly what that looks like in Google Maps. So we took those blueprints and we geo-referenced them so we knew exactly, we put them into our GPSs so we knew exactly where we would go. And this picture may have even been taken like right around the time they were putting it in. But that isn't too far from here. And then here's an example of like what a pretty good native site was looking like a couple years after it was put in. I think this is over by Chaska area. And we're going through there. And so that's one that has at this time a lot of black-eyed Susan flowering. And a lot of them, this is also in there because it's like a lot of them are around these containment ponds. In fact, the native ones are more likely to put around wetland areas. And this is what a alfalfa rich sort of non-native plot might look like at that same site on that same day. Just a couple years later. So this is a bunch of alfalfa. But on that same day, we found a rusty patch bumblebee, which is a federally endangered bumblebee, right in that alfalfa patch. And so there's the assumption that native plants are better, but also flowering plants that produce nectar. The bumblebee doesn't know what's native or not native necessarily. And so that was part of why we were looking at this. Is this a really good investment for our roadsides if we want to be interested in pollinators or not? So I have a bunch of figures here, graphs, and so I'm just going to go through them, but the sort of take home written there on the bottom too. And so the very first panel here says all flowers. The green line with gray shaded around it, I don't know if you can see that well, is the native sites. And the red one is the non-native sites. And we also looked at some sort of control plots nearby. But you can see that you can sort of see how many flowers were abundant through the season in these different ones. So if you focus on just the middle panel that says native flowers, you can see that the native mix definitely had more native flowers. And if you looked at than the other ones. And so that proves that seeding is indeed important to get those natives to show up. They're not just colonizing naturally, because that could happen too, right? And it does happen at some level, but if you want a lot of native plants, you're going to have to probably put them there in the first place. So that seeding is working at some level. But if you also go look at panel C, that's just introduced flowers, so plants that are non-native. And you can see that there's just, you can ignore that blue line because that was actually our other types of sites, but you can see the curve of the green and the red line look almost the same, which is to say there's just as many non-native plants in our native plantings as there are in these other ones. And so that's really a lot of weedy species are encroaching into both types of sites. And so the take-home message is here is the seedings with natives is necessary to get those native plants, but there are introduced species, weedy species everywhere. This is the same sort of stuff, but through time. So the bottom axis is now age of the site in years. So from 2 to 20 years old. And you can see, we'll look at the middle one right now in the native sites. You can see there's actually a lot of native flowers early on, but they decrease through time. And what we're finding is that you get more grass dominated through time, and a lot of these flowering plants sort of get pushed out after 20 years. And introduced flowers also show similar patterns. So again, at the bottom, all types of sites lose these forbs. So I'm showing richness, which is the number of different species in this instance, but also diversity as these sites get older. So we're losing flowers through time in all these sites. And like I was saying, so this is just like the percent coverage. So we would throw this quadrant down and we'd say, is this bare ground, or are these grasses, or are these flowering plants? And you can see that the red line at top is going up. That means that those, and you've got on the bottom, you have the age of the site. So these older sites have a lot more grass and a lot less bare ground or flower cover. And I think just a little bit in the sake of, well, no, I'll keep going here. What time are we going till about 8? Yeah, all right. We're doing fine. We'll get there. So another interesting thing we found is, so we're putting all these seeds down here, but actually most of the diversity we're seeing is coming from these colonizing species. So even though we're getting some native flowers, most of the flowers there are weedy species that are moving in at both types of sites. We also did a very in-depth analysis about which species that were in the seed mix did we actually find. And so there's 20 different forbs that we put in this native seed mix. How many of them were we actually finding 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later? And so there was, and there's a lot of different types of seed mixes we're looking at. So there was 14 different native species that were at least twice as likely to be detected where they were seeded. But then there's 22 species that we're putting in these seed mixes that we never found once over the summer. And so we're putting these, maybe expensive prairie mixes down, and maybe a mouse comes and eats it, or it never germinates or grows. And some of these, of course, are perennial, so it might take 5 years before they ever get a flower in the first place. And so we detected a lot of these plants that we're never actually seeing. And so at like surface level, we would definitely say like a very diverse seed mix and a very diverse roadside is what you want. But in practice, what you're seeing is you can put a very diverse seed mix out there, but if a lot of those species never establish, you're kind of throwing your money in the wind. And so that was part of what we were looking at. And so we had some ideas about how we could sort of streamline these seed mixes, because to be frank, there's not a huge opportunity to like completely change the management and get a ton of money to start weeding roadsides. And a lot of these are pretty small sites. It might make sense if you have a big one, but they're all over the state. And so we actually recommended reducing the diversity of these seed mixes, but putting in the plants that we know establish, and maybe even adding some of those native seeds to some of the non-native seed mixes. So you've got, okay, alfalfa and clover and a handful of natives that we think will have a good chance of establishing. And so sort of lowering the diversity of the native mixes, bumping up the diversity of the non-native mixes, and using those cost savings to try to put them in more places, because they're expensive. And so that was one of the sort of ideas that we were getting from that. now we sort of hop into the pollinator side of things. So that was just the plants. And I'm getting pretty close here if you're running out of steam, but we had sort of two questions. So does floral diversity predict pollinator diversity or abundance? So do sites with lots of flowers and more flowers have more bumblebees and butterflies? And secondly, does this native vegetation attract more bumblebees and butterflies? And I'll just throw in the caveat there that we were just looking at, are they present in the site? So like we know, and we're also just looking at bumblebees and butterflies, and there's lots of other bees that we weren't studying. And so this is, again, a little context about what we were doing. But the red line here is bumblebees. The blue line is butterflies. And you can basically see we have what's called the diversity index. It's just, it's just a basic, you can think of it as like how many different species are there, some level of diversity versus how many of those quadrats contain flowers. And so you can see that both of them have a positive slope. So as you get more flowers, you get more bumblebees and butterflies, but that relationship is a lot stronger for the bumblebees. And one of the main reasons for that is even though they're both feeding on flowers, the bumblebees will go into their nest and be out of sight if they're not feeding, whereas a butterfly might just be sitting there using it as habitat. So that part is very different. So 90% of the bumblebees we found were actively feeding at the time, where only 10 or 15% of the butterflies were. And so, the butterfly might just be sitting on a blade of grass, where the bumblebees don't do that as much. They'd be going back to their nest where we don't see them. Greater floral diversity supports both greater bumblebee and butterfly diversity in roadside. So this is just, that previous one was abundance. This is just, so how many flowers of any type, and this one is the diversity of flowers. So there are a lot of different types of flowers, and both of these have a positive relationship. So more diversity in the flowers, you get more diversity in the bumblebees and butterflies you're seeing. Now this is interesting, and so this is the same sort of graph, but we're looking at the proportion of flowers in the site that are native. So if on the one there, the furthest right part of that axis would mean every flower in the site is a native flower, and the 0 is none of them are native and everywhere in between. And what we're seeing here is that these native flowers in this instant don't have a superpower for attracting these butterflies and bumblebees. That might be different for host plants, but you can see that native flowers are not attracting greater pollinator diversity. The native sites didn't have more pollinator diversity than the non-native sites overall in our study. And so again, that goes to like, well, maybe if we switch the seed mixes and put more flowers everywhere, we might be doing better than trying to create some sort of super native prairie. And so overall, our implications for practice: more flowers are better for these pollinators. That's expected. We see wide variation in use. There's some sites that don't have a lot of butterflies and bumblebees, but some that had a lot. Okay, here's what I was talking about. The bumblebees are more responsive to flowers because of the differences in how they're using roadsides. And so the sort of big picture is, to support these pollinators and roadsides, we should manage for more floral diversity and abundance, which is different than just seeding for more diversity and abundance. If you just put a really diverse seed mix in there, it doesn't mean you're going to get a really nice diverse prairie. And so that's sort of what I say here. And so we sort of said we have this more flowers everywhere approach, which might be reducing the diversity and cost of some of these mixes, but increasing where they're used on the landscape. And that, a roadside is never going to be our pristine habitat, but it's everywhere, and we're trying to make it as good as we can. And then this sort of set it and forget it is which is in line with how these are managed. With getting a native prairie in a restoration just takes an enormous amount of management that is probably outside the scope of what is going to happen on your typical roadside. And so that's not really working if the goal is to have these perfect native communities. But if the goal is to do something for the pollinators, we think a little mix there is what's going on. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there, and we will take any questions you have.